Elisa Lee, for your insightful words. Our forum consists of 3 parts: speeches, panel discussion, and performance. We are now moved to our keynote section, where we will hear from 4 distinguished speakers. Our first keynote speaker is Professor Yuki Tanaka. A history and researcher who has dedicated his career to examine the dark legacy of war, including Japanese war crimes during World War II. Professor Tanaka was a research professor at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, Hiroshima City University, until his retirement in 2015. He has been a visiting professor at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a Sir Ninian Stevens visiting scholar at the Law School, University of Melbourne. His publications include Intra-Atrocity, New Insights into the US-Japan Alliance, Hidden Horrors, Japanese War Crimes in World War II, Japan's Comfort Woman, Sexual Slavery and Prostitution during World War II and the US occupation, Beyond Victor's Justice, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial Revisiting. He has also authored numerous books in Japanese. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yuki Tanaka.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful gathering. The title of my presentation is Sharing Pain Generates Hope for the Future. During the Asia-Pacific War, which lasted 15 years from September 1931 to August 1945, Japanese imperial forces committed numerous atrocities against civilians in occupied territories, as well as combatants and prisoners of wars of enemy forces. I don't have time to go, discuss many war crime cases that the Japanese committed. So I just give 3 examples. First, the Japanese military operations against the Chinese forces often involved mass killings of local inhabitants who sympathized with the anti-Japanese campaign. The particularly Chinese village or town community was identified as hostile. The Japanese troops had license to destroy the entire community, killing all its inhabitants. The Chinese called this ruthless practice Sangguan Zhaojian. Sorry, my Chinese is not really good. Literally means 3 lightning strategies, because the Japanese robbed the community of its possessions, killed all the inhabitants, and burned all the buildings. During such operations, Japanese soldiers often committed rape. A typical and most brutal example was the Nanjing massacre in 1937. Japanese occupation forces in China used chemical and bacteriological weapons against both civilians and military targets. Special organization in Guangdong Army. Guangdong Army means the Japanese army stationed in Manchukuo. And in this army, there's an organization called Unit 731, which was responsible for developing various types of bacteriological weapons using deadly pathogens such as plagues, typhoid, cholera, anthrax, and other viruses and bacteria. The same unit also conducted experiments testing these weapons on many Chinese prisoners as well as some Allied prisoners of war. The Japanese imperial forces operated a large-scale system of military sex slavery It was called the Comfort Woman System. In addition to Korean and Chinese, many women from Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia and Malaysia were pressed into sexual slavery. In Indonesia, a few hundred Dutch women selected from the detainees were also coerced into becoming a comfort woman. It is impossible to know exactly how many women were involved, but it is estimated to be about 100,000, and 80% of them are believed to have been Koreans. Although these women were exploited under the pretext of preventing rape and venereal diseases, the provision of comfort women was not an effective measure for resolving either problem. In fact, many of these comfort women were victims of rape committed by the Japanese troops. From this examination of Japanese military behavior during the 15 Years' War, it is clear that between September 1931 and August 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, under the supreme command of Emperor Hirohito, fought extremely destructive battles against the Chinese and Allied forces in many parts of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. In particular, the Japanese military in China waged a war of consistent aggression from the outset. It is estimated that the number of Chinese victims came to about 20 million. In addition to a phenomenal number of Chinese victims, the following are the estimated number of other Asian fatalities of Japanese military violence during the 15 years of war. 1.5 million in India, 2 million in Vietnam, 100,000 in Malaya and Singapore, 1.1 million in the Philippines, 4 million in Indonesia, and if the losses of the Pacific Islanders are added, it can be speculated that about 30 million people died as a result of the war that Japan conducted. The number of victims of the Holocaust is estimated to be between 5.8 and 6 million. Of course, the victims of well-planned genocide committed by the Nazi over 5 years cannot be easily compared with the 30 million direct and indirect victims of the Japanese military activities in the Asia-Pacific over 15 years. Unlike the Nazi regime, the Japanese military government did not entertain a clear policy of genocide. Yet, considering the massive number of the victims, consequently, it can be said that the Japanese treatment of the Asian and Pacific Islanders during the Asia-Pacific War was undoubtedly genocidal. The world's first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima at 8:15 on 6 August 1945, followed by a second on Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. on August 9. The victims of the bombs were not only Japanese nationals, but also many Koreans who were brought to Japan and forced to work at the military arsenals. In Nagasaki, there were also some Australian and Dutch POWs from the Allied forces captured by the Japanese military. Tens of thousands others died soon after the bombs were dropped owing to lack of medical supplies. And by the end of 1945, an estimated 140,000 people had died in Hiroshima, including 30,000 Koreans, while 70,000 died in Nagasaki, including 10,000 Koreans. Countless more have died from various after effects, including irradiation, since 1945. Many of those who lived through this hellish experience also suffered serious psychological damage, and the majority of victims of the atomic bombs were civilians. In addition, the US forces dropped a total of 160,800 tons of bombs and incendiaries on Japan. More than 90% of these were dropped from B-29 in the last 5 months of the Pacific War, and consequently Japan as a nation without an adequate air defense system allowed 393 towns and villages and cities to be victimized by the US aerial bombing. The estimated total of number of the victims was 1.02 million, including 560,000 deaths. And it is said that 70% of the casualties were women and children. In this sense, the phrase discriminated bombing is more appropriate than discriminated bombing against civilians is more appropriate than indiscriminate bombing, since the majority of victims of strategic bombing were civilians, in particular women and children. Well then, why did the Japanese fail to develop a sense of collective responsibility for the wartime and colonial atrocities they committed, and why do they continue to fail to do so? The Japanese government and the Japanese people in general always emphasized the fact that Japan is the only nation in the world to have suffered the atomic bombing, while they tend to ignore the terrible wartime atrocities committed by the Japanese imperial forces. Of course, a sense of responsibility is closely linked to a sense of justice, and a collective sense of justice is an essential factor in the concept and practice of democracy. The failure to seriously address the issue of war responsibility is therefore not simply a matter of historical perspective. It is fundamentally a problem of a flaw in Japan's present democracy. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered to the Allied nation following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, which indiscriminately killed over 210,000 people, mostly civilians, including 40,000 Koreans. The US proudly claimed this victory of freedom and democracy against Japanese militarism and fascism. At the same time, President Truman justified this genocide with the ironic excuse that it was, quote and unquote, to avoid insofar as possible the killing of civilians and to end the long-lasting bloody war in the Asia-Pacific. In this way, the US created a myth so as to evade responsibility for its grave war crimes. As a consequence, the opportunity to thoroughly examine the criminality of nuclear weapons was lost.